What happens when a CEO buys a truck at his own dealership, and here's something that makes him stop cold. Jason Carter, the CEO of Carter Auto Group, a well-known regional truck and SUV dealership with 16 locations, had built his company on promises of honesty, reliability, and community-worth service. From the very beginning, Jason believed in treating every customer with respect, whether they were buying their first used pickup or a brand-new heavy-duty truck. But lately, something felt off. He had started receiving anonymous letters and online reviews hinting at unfair sales tactics, discriminatory treatment, and unethical upselling. His general managers insisted it was all exaggerated, just a few disgruntled customers. But Jason wasn't convinced, determined to get the unfair truth. Jason Carter stared at the customer review on his screen. Hidden fees, pushy salesmen, total scam. His truck dealership, once known for integrity, was now drowning in one-star ratings. The financial reports looked good, but something wasn't adding up. He studied his reflection in the office window, then made a decision. If he wanted the truth about what was happening on his sales floor, he couldn't walk in as the boss. He needed to become someone else entirely. A regular customer with no connections to the business he'd built from nothing. He went undercover, dressed in jeans and a flannel shirt, posing as an average customer. As he stood at the counter, ready to finalize the purchase of a modest work truck, a voice behind him, just one customer, said something that made him freeze. Dan Reynolds was on the surface everything you'd want in a leader. As the sales manager at Carter's Trucks, he consistently delivered results that exceeded expectations. Every month, Dan's numbers told a story of excellence. A record-breaking volume of trucks sold and seemingly happy customers walking out the door. In board meetings, Jason Carter often singled him out as an example of what other locations should strive to. "Dan's got the magic touch," Jason had said more than once, pointing to charts that showed soaring sales. To anyone observing from the outside, Dan wasn't just a great employee, he was the dealership's rising star. Someone destined for even bigger roles within the company. Within the dealership itself, Dan's presence was hard to miss. He had a knack for captivating his team, hosting team meetings that felt less like business and more like pep rallies, designed to keep morale high. Behind the glass walls of the conference room, he would clap his hands together and rally his team with phrases about winning the week and how every sale brings us closer to being the best in the business. Many of these moments were even highlighted in internal newsletters, where photos of Dan standing confidently in front of his motivated sales staff circulated through the company email chain. The write-ups praised his leadership, his vision, and his results, painting a picture of someone who lived and breathed the values of Carter's Trucks. It wasn't uncommon for colleagues to call Dan the very definition of a company man. But something didn't sit right with Jason. For all the impressive reports and glowing accolades, there were inconsistencies he couldn't ignore. The numbers looked fantastic on paper, yet customer complaints were rising at a rate that couldn't be brushed aside. At first, these complaints trickled in sporadically. Mails from frustrated truck buyers who felt misled by unclear pricing or pressured into packages. Jason chalked it up to simple misunderstandings. After all, sales were by nature a high-pressure environment. But his discomfort grew when these complaints became more specific, offering details that painted a far different picture of his trusted team. One email in particular stood out. A customer described how they were assured they were paying the base cost for a truck, only to find thousands in unexpected fees slipped into the final paperwork. When they challenged the charges, they claimed to be dismissed or redirected like their concerns didn't matter. Another buyer wrote about walking into the dealership for a modest, budget-friendly vehicle and leaving overwhelmed, having signed for a truck stacked with extra, non-negotiable add-ons they never wanted. And then there were complaints of outright hostility, rude, impatient interactions that left customers feeling unwelcome. Each time, Jason sent these complaints down to management, right into the hands of Dan Reynolds. Each time, Dan had a ready explanation, a misunderstanding, an isolated incident, or on rare occasions a sales rep failing to follow policy. Jason wanted to believe that Dan's answers held weight. After all, this was the same man he had publicly praised as the dealership's top performer, but doubt crept in. One letter, sent by a retired schoolteacher, described how she'd been repeatedly told she couldn't back out of a deal for a truck, even though the terms had changed from what she was originally quoted. The details of the story gnawed at Jason. His dealerships had prided themselves on fairness from the very beginning. Stories like this shouldn't exist. He started to look at Dan's numbers, those shining statistics he had once held up as proof of success, through a different lens. Could these glowing results be masking unethical tactics? Despite his reservations, Dan's image as the perfect employee continued to hold steady. During meetings with staff, he smiled effortlessly and kept things light. He wasn't just leading, he was performing. When Jason watched him interact with his team, he saw nothing but energy and control, an atmosphere entirely in sync with what a well-oiled, high-performing sales team should feel like. But quietly, behind the scenes, Jason began piecing things together. Complaints were trending upward, not downward, despite Dan's supposed efforts to address them. And while customer satisfaction surveys completed on site looked positive, off-site reviews told a completely different story, one of disappointment and mistrust. Jason's deeper dive into the numbers didn't help to quiet his concerns. He noticed odd patterns. Dan's effort to excel to a... What unsettled Jason even more was how strategic Dan seemed to be in keeping these problems from surfacing where they could cause the most scrutiny. The frustration Jason saw brewing in the complaints didn't seem to match the calm, polished numbers handed to him at meetings. And the elephant in the room, though Jason hadn't quite named it out loud, was trust. He didn't just admire Dan Reynolds, he trusted him deeply as an extension of his own integrity. Dan wasn't just a great manager in Jason's eyes, he was someone Jason had believed would uphold and enhance Carter Auto Group's culture of honesty. That trust was what made Jason hesitate to act too quickly, but it was also what made the slowly shattering cracks all the harder to ignore. Jason decided to sit in on one of Dan's motivational meetings one morning, quietly observing from the corner of the room. It was everything he expected, uplifting, full of energy, and focused squarely on sales goals. But it lacked any mention of customers, their needs, or their experience. Words like integrity and common pasting. But in Dan's meeting, those concepts took a back seat to quotas and upselling. Jason left feeling uneasy, suspecting that something crucial had shifted under the surface. Still unwilling to make accusations without proof, Jason considered his next move carefully. He thought back to the letter from the elderly teacher, the dozens of similar complaints, and the numbers that didn't seem to tell the full story. There was too much smoke for there not to be a fire. But none of it made sense with the Dan Reynolds who people raved about, the one who appeared to carry himself with such pride and charm. The contradictions between that image and the complaints left only one solution if Jason wanted real answers: to see it all with his own eyes. By the time Jason arrived at his decision, it wasn't really a decision anymore. It was inevitable. Data, reports, and emails could only tell half a story. If he wanted to know exactly what was happening under Dan's leadership, he would need to walk into the heart of the sales floor, not as Jason Carter, the CEO, but as someone invisible. By stepping away from the safety of the boardroom and donning the guise of someone else entirely, he could figure out the truth. The polished version of events that everyone seemed eager to present to him had to be peeled back. Sometimes appearances lied, and Jason was about to find out how deep the deception went. Jason Carter stood in front of his bathroom mirror, almost unrecognizable. His signature neatly trimmed beard was now shaved down to rough stubble. The crisp, tailored suits he had worn for years were replaced with a faded flannel shirt, a work jacket, and steel-toe boots scuffed just enough to look authentic. He tilted his head, adjusting the baseball cap low enough to shadow his eyes, and gave a... Satisfied, he grabbed a set of keys off the counter and walked out the door as someone else, Mike Thompson, construction worker, and a man in search of a reasonable deal on a truck. As Jason, now Mike, stepped into the dealership he knew so well, he was immediately struck by how different it felt to experience it as a regular customer. The space was familiar, but now it carried an edge of tension he hadn't noticed before. Sales staff scattered across the floor stood in small clusters, keeping their eyes trained on the entrance like hawks tracking prey. A salesman in a crisp shirt spotted Jason and was at his side within seconds, clipboard in hand and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. The introductions were polite but hurried, practiced, as though they were part of a script. It wasn't long before Jason realized this was just the beginning of what seemed to be a highly rehearsed routine. What struck him first was the way the salespeople skipped over key details. They would breeze past straightforward questions about pricing and focus instead on feature-heavy upgrades. Within minutes, Jason was being steered toward trucks that stretched the upper limit of his supposed budget. Each one came with a pitch about the Carter's protection package, described as a must-have for anyone serious about safeguarding their vehicle. He remembered approving this optional add-on years earlier, but now, standing there, it didn't feel so optional. Not once was he told it could be removed. The pitch slid right into the conversation like it was an embedded part of the truck's price. Jason moved through the sales process as quietly as he could, asking broad questions and pretending to weigh his options. It was during this back and forth that he first noticed a young salesman, Tom, working at a nearby desk. Tom seemed out of place amidst the polished pitchmen around him. His movements were hesitant, and his eyes darted between the customers seated in front of him and Dan Reynolds, who stood by the back wall, supervising everything from a slight distance. Jason watched closely as Tom fumbled with a stack of paperwork, his hands trembling as he explained terms to the customer in a low voice. Every so often, Tom glanced nervously back at Dan, whose expression remained unreadable. When Jason's turn came to sit down with Tom, he was greeted with a polite but shaky smile. Tom quickly introduced himself and began filling out a worksheet based on the truck Jason had picked. His pen moved fast, but his discomfort was obvious. Jason leaned forward, keeping his voice casual. "Busy day, huh?" he asked. Tom nodded quickly, but didn't look up. "Yeah, something like that," he muttered, scratching down notes in the margins of the form. Jason didn't press yet. This wasn't the moment, but he couldn't help but notice the way Tom's knee bounced nervously under the desk. There was more going on here than just a busy workday. As Jason continued through the process, his focus shifted to the overall atmosphere of the sales floor. He began noticing patterns, behaviors that might have gone overlooked if he weren't paying attention. One couple, seated a few tables away, asked about the breakdown of their costs, only to be told vaguely that, "Everything's included, don't worry about it." Jason's stomach twisted as he realized just how often customers were likely being kept in the dark. These weren't existing stakes, it was starting to look like strategy. Jason waited until Tom handed him a basic breakdown of his own deal before asking a direct question. "So this protection package," he said, tapping the paper. "What if I don't need it?" Tom froze for a split second, his pen hovering mid-air. He glanced up at Jason, unsure of how to answer, then back toward Dan, who had started making his way across the room. Jason caught the hesitation and pushed gently. "It's optional, right?" Tom swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. It's part of the price." His words stumbled together, his discomfort bleeding through. Jason leaned back slowly, keeping his expression neutral, but inside something clicked. This wasn't just about Tom being a nervous new hire. There was pressure here, heavy enough to make a seasoned salesman hesitate in front of a customer. Jason didn't get the chance to press further before Dan appeared behind Tom, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Everything okay here?" Dan smiled, his tone casual, but his eyes locked on Jason with a sharpness that felt anything but friendly. Jason smiled back and nodded. "Yeah, just checking on a few details," he said, folding the paper and slipping it into his pocket. The moment passed, but Jason wasn't about to let it fade. He excused himself from the table and stepped into a quiet corner of the showroom, pretending to take a phone call. As he stood there, his hand slipped into his jacket pocket and activated the voice recorder on his phone. This was going deeper than he'd thought, and he needed proof. Proof that couldn't be dismissed or explained away later. By the end of the day, Jason had captured several key moments on tape. He recorded the rushed pitches, the refusal to clarify fees, and the interactions that felt less like customer service and more like coercion. What hit hardest, though, was the conversation he overheard on his way out. Two salesmen, seated by the coffee station, joked openly about how easy it was to tack on unnecessary packages without customers even noticing. Most of them don't even read the final papers, one laughed. The protection plan, that's like guaranteed money every time. Jason stepped outside, his boots crunching on the gravel lot as he made his way back to his car. He leaned against the hood, staring out at the rows of gleaming trucks, and let out a slow breath. What he had seen today confirmed his worst fears. The culture inside his business, the one he had built on promises of trust and transparency, was rotting from the inside. Dan Reynolds wasn't just skimming the surface of dishonesty. He had created a system designed to squeeze customers dry while keeping the numbers pristine on paper. This wasn't just about confronting Dan anymore. It was bigger than him. Jason knew he had to get to the bottom of why his employees felt free, or even obligated, to act this way. Somewhere beneath the polished pitches and the fake smiles was the truth. And Jason wouldn't stop until he uncovered every last piece of it. Mark Henderson walked into Carter's trucks, clutching a folder filled with budget estimates, savings projections, and carefully laid plans. A delivery driver by trade, Mark had spent months researching a truck reliable enough for his work but modest enough to fit his family's tight budget. With two young kids and his eldest daughter about to start college in the fall, every dollar mattered. This wasn't just a vehicle, it was a lifeline that would keep his business running and his family secure. The moment he stepped through the glass doors, he took a deep breath and tried to shake off his nerves. He had no idea the decision he'd made to shop here would soon threaten to unravel everything. Jason, still undercover as Mike Thompson, noticed Mark right away. In his work boots and faded jacket, Mark looked like the kind of customer Carter Trucks was built to support. Hard-working, practical, and community-oriented. Jason watched as a salesman approached him within moments, his polished pitch already on full display. At first, the interaction seemed smooth. The two men exchanged smooth, the two men conflict talk. Mark explained his situation simply. He needed a durable truck for hauling loads but couldn't go beyond a strict financial limit. Jason, standing off to the side, caught himself nodding along. Mark's story struck a chord with him, reminding him of the people the dealership was supposed to serve. The process started the way it always did, with enthusiasm and encouragement. The salesman, friendly and confident, assured Mark there were plenty of trucks within his price range, even throwing in a comment about their great financing options. But as time went on, Jason began to notice a familiar pattern. The salesman began steering Mark toward models that were just outside his original budget, emphasizing optional features Mark hadn't asked about it enough. At one point, Jason overheard the salesman say, "If you're serious about keeping this truck on the road, the Carter protection package is essential." It was the same line Jason had heard during his own undercover pitch. Mark, still optimistic but visibly cautious, pressed the salesman on the pricing, asking for clarity on the final costs. "I just need to make sure everything adds up," he said, holding his folder tightly. Jason could hear the slight strain in Mark's voice, the tone of someone trying to stay polite but not entirely comfortable. What happened next changed everything. When the salesman handed Mark the worksheet with the preliminary quote, Jason saw the slight furrow in Mark's brow as he scanned the numbers. "Wait," Mark said slowly, pointing to a line labeled "Dealer Protection Fees." The total had grown significantly, well beyond the budget Mark had walked in with. "What are these charges?" The salesman's demeanor shifted slightly. His tone grew defensive, though he kept his smile plastered in place. "Oh, those are standard," he said with a wave of his hand. "Every dealership has them. It covers administrative costs, you know. Nothing out of the ordinary." Mark's voice grew quieter, but the weight in it was impossible to miss. "This pushes me way over budget. My oldest daughter's starting college this fall. We've been planning this purchase for months, timing it with her graduation." He paused, his hands gripping the edge of the paper now. "I don't think I can do this if these fees can't be adjusted." Jason felt a pang of something close to anger as he watched the scene unfold. He hadn't wanted to intervene, not yet at least, but seeing Mark's frustration hit close to home. Here was a man doing his best to scrape together what he could, only to be met with stonewalling and scripted reassurances that seemed to deliberately ignore his reality. It wasn't just unethical, it was cruel. As Mark pressed further, asking for specifics on the fees, the salesman seemed unable or unwilling to offer further clarification. The atmosphere in the room grew tense, and that's when Dan Reynolds entered the picture. He approached the table with his typical confidence, a calm, practiced authority radiating from him. With a slight, seemingly friendly gesture, he placed a hand on the salesman's shoulder. "Is everything all right here?" he asked, his voice smooth and measured. Mark looked up hopefully. "I'm just trying to understand these fees. They're way more than I expected, and it's making this harder than it should be." Dan's smile widened slightly, but his words carried none of the warmth his expression suggested. "Well, Mr. Henderson, those fees are part of the structure. This isn't something we can adjust. It's standard across the board." His tone was final, leaving no room for negotiation. When Mark tried again, explaining how the added cost would jeopardize his ability to make the purchase, Dan gave a quick nod but didn't budge. "I understand your concerns," he said flatly, "but these terms are part of the process." Jason, standing just close enough to catch every word, forced himself to stay silent. He wasn't ready to reveal his identity or his purpose yet, but the frustration bubbling up inside him made it difficult to hold back. Mark's shoulders slumped slightly as he realized he wasn't going to get anywhere. He folded the worksheet and tucked it into his folder, mumbling something polite as he excused himself. Jason followed at a safe distance as Mark stepped outside, leaning wearily against the truck he had been so close to buying. He pulled out his phone, staring at it for a long moment, as though debating whether to make a call. The defeated look on his face was something Jason wouldn't forget. Inside, Jason replayed the encounter in his head. This wasn't just a single bad experience or a moment of poor judgment from one employee. It was systematic. The hidden fees, the scripted dismissiveness, the refusal to help a customer in need. It all pointed to something deeper. Jason remembered the other complaints he had read before going undercover. The elderly school teacher, the family in financial distress, the countless online accusations of dishonesty. They weren't isolated incidents. They were proof of a much larger problem. Later that day, Jason approached Tom, the nervous young salesman he'd spoken with before. Keeping his voice casual, he asked a few questions about the dealership's practices. It didn't take long for Tom to let something slip. "We're supposed to keep the initial quotes low," he admitted quietly, "get people emotionally invested in the vehicle, then introduce the mandatory fees during final paperwork." Jason's heart sank. Tom wasn't just describing an unspoken culture, he was describing a strategy, one that had been carefully designed and executed under Dan Reynolds' leadership. The realization hit like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just a failing system, it was a deliberate one. As Jason replayed the day's events in his mind later that night, one scene refused to leave him. Mark's quiet words at the table, "My daughter's starting college this fall," echoed in his head, a reminder of what was at stake for honest, hard-working people who trusted his company to treat them fairly. This wasn't just about hidden fees or deceptive practices. It was about the people they hurt, the lives they disrupted, and the trust they destroyed. For Jason, the decision was clear. He couldn't sit by and let this continue, not one more day. But he also knew he needed more evidence, more testimony, more undeniable proof to confront Dan Reynolds and hold him accountable. Stepping back into Mike Thompson's shoes, Jason prepared for what came next, determined to gather everything he could to end the corruption that had infected him. There was no turning back now. Jason wasn't sure what frustrated him more, the blatant dishonesty he'd witnessed on the sales floor or the culture of fear that kept employees quiet. It became clear to him that Dan Reynolds hadn't just allowed unethical behavior, he'd built an entire system designed to thrive on deception. While customers felt the effects of these actions the hardest, the toxic environment fed an equally brutal cycle for the staff. Those who followed the rules, Dan's rules, were rewarded. Those who didn't, like one former salesman named Josh, were cast aside. Tom, Jason's unlikely confidant, revealed more about how the system worked during one of their hushed conversations outside the dealership's break room. Lowering his voice and glancing over his shoulder every few seconds, Tom hesitated before he spoke. Dan, Mr. Reynolds, he corrected himself shakily. He has this system. We're supposed to keep the initial quotes low, get people emotionally invested in the vehicle, then introduce the mandatory fees during final paperwork. Jason studied Tom's expression, the mixture of unease and resignation. Tom wasn't proud of this. He wasn't hesitant because he believed in it, but because he feared what happened if he didn't play along. Tom tugged at the collar of his shirt as he continued. Look, I've seen what happens when someone doesn't stick to his plan. He hesitated before adding, Josh, the guy who sold that truck to Mr. Henderson, refused to go along. He tried to be upfront about prices, about fees. He wanted to stick to what's right, you know? Dan made an example out of him. He's gone now. Jason had heard pieces of Josh's story before, but hearing it from Tom gave it more weight. Josh's refusal to participate in the scheme had cost him his job. Jason could see how this rippled through the staff. Fear kept them quiet. As Tom described it, Reynolds had created a situation where employees felt like they had no choice but to fall in line. The dealership's numbers were climbing, commissions rolled in quickly for top performers, and anyone who questioned the process didn't last long enough to see change. Jason spent the next few days in Mike Thompson mode, observing smaller details that now took on greater significance. Conversations near the finance office sounded normal at first glance, but with each passing day, Jason started catching their real meaning. One particular exchange between two salesmen made his stomach turn. Poor guy, one laughed, was so excited about the truck he didn't even notice we'd added the premium package. By the time he figured it out, the cooling-off period was over. His coworker grinned, shaking his head. Easy money, man. No one reads contracts under pressure. These weren't rumors or a few bad apples operating under the radar. It was bigger than that. The jokes, the pressure tactics during sales pitches, and the coached silence from employees like Tom all pointed to a system that had been built methodically. Jason started compiling mental notes, careful to document every unethical practice he encountered. He discreetly recorded conversations capturing damning evidence of how the entire operation functioned. Walking through the lot, he overheard salespeople inflating trade-in values, only to knock them down during final negotiation. Inside the conference room, he paused to record murmured discussions of falsified finance applications, a way to secure approvals customers wouldn't otherwise qualify for. Trade-ins were undervalued, warranties were misrepresented. Everything about the operation was structured to maximize profit at the expense of trust. It wasn't long before Jason began piecing together Dan's mentality behind it all, both from what he saw and from the whispers he overheard. Reynolds had no qualms about keeping the CEO of Carter Auto Group, Jason himself, in the dark. The owner, Carter, Reynolds reportedly told a trusted salesman once, "He's too busy counting profits from his multiple locations to care about our methods. As long as the numbers keep climbing, he stays away." That was what stung Jason the most. He had trusted Reynolds to represent the values of his business, but instead, Reynolds had used that trust as a shield to protect his own corrupt practices. Time after time, Jason uncovered calculations that exposed Reynolds' complete indifference toward the lives of his customers. He saw how the dealership preyed on vulnerable buyers, like Mark Henderson, who walked in desperate for a fair deal and left saddled with hidden fees they hadn't agreed to. There was no empathy in this system, only arrogance. Reynolds' confidence in his foolproof system was unshakable. More than once, Jason compiled evidence of Reynolds bragging about how airtight his operation was. "I've built this system over 2 years and it's perfect," Reynolds crowed during a recorded conversation. "The owner is too trusting, the customers are too desperate, and the staff is foolproof." Each interaction added to Jason's growing determination. He struggled to keep his emotions in check as the enormity of the deception became clear. Reynolds had not only corrupted the dealership's culture of honesty, he had folded it into his business strategy, a calculated structure designed to exploit and control everyone at every level. Somewhere along the way, Reynolds had stopped seeing Carter's trucks as a service-oriented business and started treating it as his own personal money-making machine. "Between us," Reynolds once boasted in a conversation Jason recorded, "I've made more in kickbacks this year than Carter probably makes in legitimate profit." By the end of the undercover investigation, Jason's phone held hours of recordings, including some of Reynolds himself, explaining his strategy in chilling detail. Jason sat in his car one evening, scrolling through audio files and handwritten notes. He played back a recording of yet another manipulated trade-in deal, visibly wincing as he heard Reynolds outline how they adjusted the customer's paperwork to inflate profits. "This isn't oversight," Jason muttered to himself. "This is theft." There was no room for doubt anymore. Jason had more proof than he ever imagined he'd need. He had recorded Reynolds laughing off concerns about fairness. He had employees on tape discussing ways they'd forced fees onto unsuspecting buyers. He had lists of documented violations, including manipulated contracts, forged signatures, and altered documents from financing. With every file he played, Jason's anger gave way to resolve. He wasn't furious just because Reynolds had betrayed him as a leader, though that betrayal stung deeply. It was the way Reynolds had betrayed their customers, the community that trusted Carter's trucks to act with integrity. Jason stared out at the rows of trucks glinting in the fading sunlight, thinking about the lives affected by Reynolds' actions. Mark Henderson, scrambling to make sense of fees that endangered his family's finances. The elderly schoolteacher who had felt trapped into a one-sided deal. And the staff, people like Tom and Josh, navigating a system designed to leave them too scared to stand up for what they knew was right. This wasn't just about saving the company's reputation. It was about making things right for everyone who had been caught in the web Reynolds had spun over the years. Jason slipped his phone back into his pocket, tightening his grip on the steering wheel. He wasn't going to let this continue, not for another day. He had all the evidence he needed to confront Reynolds directly, and this time there would be no excuses, no polite avoidance. Jason wasn't just the CEO of Carter's Trucks anymore. He was the messenger of accountability, and he was ready to deliver a hard truth that had been ignored for far too long. Jason, still in his Mike Thompson disguise, walked into the manager's office with a casual confidence that belied the storm brewing beneath the surface. The small office, with its neatly arranged files and faint scent of air freshener, was the nerve center of the dealership, a place where the real decisions, and in this case the real damage, were made. Sitting behind the desk, Dan Reynolds glanced up, a polite smile crossing his face as he gestured for Jason to take a seat. He had no idea the man who walked in wasn't just an average customer. Jason shut the door behind him, and with it put an end to the veil of secrecy. Pulling a small recorder from his pocket, Jason placed it carefully on the desk without saying a word. Dan's smile faltered for the first time, his eyes narrowing slightly as suspicion crept in. "What's going on, Mike?" he asked, his voice steady but cautious. Jason didn't reply immediately. Instead, he reached up and removed the baseball cap that had shadowed his face for the past week. The move was simple but deliberate. revealing not Mike Thompson, the construction worker, but Jason Carter, the CEO of Carter Auto Group. Dan froze, his expression caught between disbelief and discomfort. "Mr. Carter," he said after a beat, his smile now strained, "what are you doing here?" Jason sat down across from him, leaning forward slightly. His voice was calm but firm. "What I'm doing," he said, "is cleaning up a mess you created." Dan opened his mouth to reply, but Jason didn't give him the chance. Reaching into the inside pocket of his jacket, Jason pulled out a folder, thick with printed complaints, photos of contracts, and transcriptions from his recordings. He placed it on the desk, the weight of the evidence almost as heavy as the tension in the room. "You've been busy, Dan," Jason said, his tone sharp but level. Dan blinked, his smile gone entirely now. "Look," he started, his voice wavering slightly, "if this is about some of the aggressive sales tactics, I can—" Jason cut him off with a raised hand. "Why don't I save you the trouble?" he said. He pressed a button on the recorder, and the room filled with the unmistakable sound of Dan's own voice. "The owner is too trusting, the customers are too desperate, and the staff is too afraid of losing their jobs to speak up." Jason let the sentence play out fully before pausing the recording. Dan's face paled, but he quickly recovered, leaning back in his chair and forcing a confident smirk. "Mr. Carter, you have to understand. That was taken out of context. If you let me explain—" "Explain what exactly?" Jason snapped, his voice rising slightly. "That you've systematically turned this dealership into a machine that thrives on lies. That you've preyed on customers who came here looking for fairness, not fraud. Or that you've bullied my employees into following your lead out of fear of retaliation." He leaned back, folding his arms as Dan sputtered for a reply. "Business is tough," Dan said finally, his tone defensive. "You have to make adjustments to stay competitive. This isn't about dishonesty, it's about staying ahead. Customers expect the extras nowadays, and if they don't realize it, that's not our responsibility to handhold them through the process." Jason's eyes narrowed. "Staying ahead," he repeated, anger lacing his voice. "This isn't staying ahead, Dan, it's theft. These aren't just extras. These are fees you've hidden to squeeze more money from people who trust us. And don't call it competition when you've deliberately created a system that traps customers into deals they can't escape." Dan's confidence wavered. "It's not like that," Jason interrupted again, pressing play on another recording. This one captured a conversation between Dan and a senior salesman, discussing how to push warranty packages as mandatory. "If they ask questions, stay vague," Dan's voice instructed. "By the time they figure it out, the deal's signed and that's their problem." Jason let the recording finish before turning to Dan. "Not like that." The bravado drained from Dan's expression, replaced by a simmering panic. He opened his mouth to protest, but no words came out. Jason stepped in, his voice quieter now but no less sharp. "What hurts the most, Dan, is the trust I trusted you to run this place with the values that built it. Our values. Honesty, fairness, community. And what you've done, you've torn that apart for what commission checks can." Dan's frustration flared, his tone shifting abruptly. "It's easy for you to sit there and judge me," he snapped. "You're in an office miles away, looking at spreadsheets and talking about integrity. Do you have any idea what it's like on the floor? How hard it is to keep numbers climbing when everyone else is cutting corners? I made decisions to keep this place afloat." Jason's expression stiffened. "That's a lie," he said calmly. "The numbers didn't need saving, Dan. They already worked. What you did was twist them to suit your own greed." Before Dan could respond, Jason stood up and grabbed the recorder. "This doesn't end here," he said. "We're having a meeting, all of us. Staff meeting room, 15 minutes. He strode to the door and stopped with his hand on the knob. "Be there, Dan. You're going to explain what you've done, and then you're done." With that, Jason left Dan sitting in silence. 15 minutes later, every staff member was crowded into the meeting room. The tension was thick as Jason entered, carrying the same folder and recorder from earlier. Dan sat near the back, surrounded by employees hesitant even to glance his way. Jason began calmly, addressing the room. For weeks now, I've been investigating reports about this dealership. Some of you already know what I'm talking about. A culture of dishonesty, fear, and manipulation that's gone unchecked far too long. He looked around, meeting the eyes of his employees. I trusted this place to reflect the values of the Carter Auto Group. That trust was broken. He pressed play on the recordings, letting the audio fill the room. Dan's words, candid and damning, spilled out for everyone to hear. Some staff members shifted in their seats uncomfortably. Others looked at Dan with visible anger. By the end, the room was no longer silent. Mutters of disbelief and frustration rippled through the group. When the recordings ended, Jason faced them directly. To some of you, this isn't a surprise, he said. You've been forced to play along with this system, whether you agreed with it or not. That ends today. Dan Reynolds is no longer part of this company. I've seen enough to know he does not represent who we are or who we will be. As Jason spoke, he didn't sugarcoat what came next. There's a lot of work to do, he said. Rebuilding trust, both in this room and with the customers we've wronged. Won't be easy. But I promise you, starting now, that's exactly what we're going to do. The mixture of relief and skepticism on the employees' faces told him it wouldn't happen overnight, but the shift was beginning. Jason left the room not with promises, but with the determination to ensure the culture Dan had created would never take hold again. The staff meeting Jason called that day was only the beginning. As employees sat in silence, still processing everything they had heard, Jason laid out a plan that would dismantle the toxic culture and rebuild the dealership with fairness at its core. His first order of business was direct. Dan Reynolds was officially terminated, effective immediately. Jason didn't dwell on this decision. Instead, he turned to the bigger issue. The dealership, he explained, would no longer operate under the shadow of manipulation and deceit. From that day forward, the focus would shift to transparency, honesty, and ensuring that every customer left feeling confident in their decision. Not everyone was convinced. The room was filled with skeptical looks and folded arms, especially from employees who had worked under Dan for years. Some were afraid the changes Jason was proposing wouldn't actually last, while others quietly wondered if the dealership could even survive without Reynolds' aggressive tactics. Jason took no shortcuts addressing the doubt. He acknowledged the damage done and admitted his own role in allowing the corruption to fester unchecked. But he made it clear that the dealership could only move forward by embracing a completely different way of doing business. The changes were immediate and visible. Large digital displays were installed across the showroom, showing real-time pricing and breaking down fees for every vehicle on the lot. The goal, Jason explained, was to eliminate the hidden aspect of any charges. If there was a fee, customers would see it up front, no exceptions. A newly formed transparency task force, made up of employees from both sales and service departments, was tasked with holding the dealership accountable. This group would monitor pricing practices and resolve customer concerns in real time. Jason later told the staff, "Every customer should leave here feeling like they've been treated fairly. If they're not, then we need to know why." The dealership's motto was updated to reflect these changes. Above the main entrance, bold letters now read, "Clarity, Honesty, Trust." This wasn't just branding, it was a promise. Every time employees stepped through the door, they would see those words, a reminder of the values they were now committed to upholding. For Jason, it was a symbol of accountability as much as anything else. Beyond internal changes, Jason focused on repairing the damage done to the dealership's reputation in the community. He reached out personally to every customer who had filed a complaint during Dan's tenure, starting with those who had been overcharged. These conversations were not easy. Many of the customers were still angry, and Jason listened as they detailed how those deceptive practices had impacted their lives. One customer described having to delay critical home repairs because of unexpected fees added to her vehicle's final price. Another, a single father, shared how overpaying for his truck had derailed his monthly budget. Jason didn't just listen, he acted. Refurbs were issued for every fraudulent charge uncovered, and each customer received a personal apology. The dealership's conference room became a hub of correction, where wronged customers reviewed their contracts and left with more than just refunds. They left with Jason's commitment to do better. One of the first people Jason reached out to was Mark Henderson. When Jason called to apologize, Mark was skeptical at first. But when Jason not only refunded the fees Mark had been unfairly charged, but also reinstated the college savings his family had sacrificed, Mark's tone softened. He later returned to the dealership to pick up the truck he was originally promised at the fair price, calling the experience a step toward restoring his faith. To further demonstrate their commitment, Jason announced that the dealership had established a small scholarship fund in Mark's daughter's name, offering financial support to local families in similar situations. Mark's story, once a painful symbol of corruption, became one of redemption. Inside the dealership, a much-needed reunion took place. Josh, the salesman who had been fired for refusing to engage in unethical practices, was asked to return not just as a staff member, but as the dealership's new sales trainer. Josh accepted the offer with some hesitation, knowing how much work there was to do. But Jason assured him this position wasn't just about running refresher courses. Josh would train the team in ethical sales practices, teaching them to focus on building trust and long-term relationships with customers. No more hard sells, no more bypassing questions. Josh saw this as a way to cement the positive changes that were already unfolding. And soon, his training sessions became the cornerstone of the dealership's rebuilding efforts. It didn't take long for the transformation of Carter's trucks to catch the attention of the community and the media. Local news outlets ran stories about how Jason Carter had gone undercover to expose corruption and was now leading efforts to overhaul the business. One news segment focused on the dealership's transparency initiative, showing the digital pricing boards in action. Another highlighted Mark Henderson's experience, emphasizing the steps Jason had taken to make things right. As these stories gained traction, they painted a picture of a business determined to rebuild its reputation from the ground up. The renewed customer trust wasn't just anecdotal. Customer satisfaction surveys showed a sharp increase in positive feedback. Buyers talked about being pleasantly surprised by the clarity of the process and the absence of pressure tactics. One customer shared how he chose trucks specifically because he'd heard about the changes. "I wanted to see if they were really different," he explained, "and they are. They treat you like a person here, not a paycheck." 6 months after Jason had first gone undercover, the dealership hosted a community appreciation day to thank their neighbors for giving them another chance. Families wandered the lot, enjoying free food, live music, and kids' activities. The intention was to create an inviting atmosphere where no one felt they were being sold to. Jason walked through the event, watching as customers stayed long after the festivities ended, simply enjoying the experience of being there. Near the end of the day, Jason saw Tom, the young salesman who had originally hinted at the pressure tactics under Dan Reynolds. Tom was speaking with an elderly couple about their options for a smaller truck. Jason noticed how carefully Tom walked them through the process, explaining every line on the quote and answering their questions. A third, Henderson, was there too, now a regular visitor to the dealership. He had become an unofficial ambassador of sorts, sharing his story as an example of how much Jason's efforts had changed the business. As he watched his truck get a routine service check, Mark spoke to Jason about why he stuck around. "Integrity still matters in business," he said simply. For Jason, those words carried more weight than any sales figure or glowing review. They were proof that the hard work of rebuilding wasn't just paying off, it was reshaping the dealership into what it was always meant to be. The event ended with a sense of renewed energy, both for the staff and the community. Jason knew there was still work to be done, but for the first time in months, it felt like they were truly moving forward. From transparent pricing to ethical practices, every change was a step toward making things right, not just for the customers but for everyone who had been impacted. The trust they had lost was beginning to be earned back one honest deal at a time. The dealership wasn't just selling trucks anymore. It was proving that success could be measured by something more meaningful than profit. A deep commitment to transparency, fairness, and the community they served. Jason Carter's journey proved one thing: true success comes from integrity, not deception. When Carter's trucks fell into corruption, it wasn't the numbers that revealed the problem. It was the broken trust between the dealership and its community. By confronting hard truths and prioritizing ethics, Jason turned the dealership's renewal wasn't just good for the community. It demonstrated that honesty is a sound foundation for success. Doing the right thing may be difficult, but it's always worth it.